Welcome to the Biltmore Church Podcast. We are back for season 5, and we're so glad that you're here with us today for the podcast episode where we're in the middle of our 21 days of prayer teaching series here at our church. God's been doing some amazing things through our people, and then we get to come on here every week and have awesome follow-up conversations, answer your questions, and have just great discussions about prayer, about many, many, many other things. And so today is an awesome episode because we're going to be talking about prayer, but also we're going to be doing a little Ask Pastor Bruce.
Yes.
We've got some of your questions you've asked in the past, some questions that come up often that he's going to be answering today. I'm very excited for you to get to listen in on some of those answers. He's got some very wise instruction for all of us today. But before we jump in to that discussion, Michelle, like I mentioned, we are in our 21 Days of Prayer teaching series. In fact, we're actually getting closer to the end. So I want to just start by asking maybe what's the biggest takeaway from 21 Days of Prayer so far?
Oof. You know, I think even if what you're praying for doesn't change, I think it's the intimacy with the Lord that changes. And so sometimes we just need that encouragement to ask God. Maybe it's, this seems too hard, or maybe it's just the asking again. And so we need that courage from one another to ask God again. And usually what we're asking the Lord for in this series is not something that just comes up in casual conversation. So It's like that. And when you are that honest and vulnerable and open in a dialogue, it just creates an intimacy with the Lord. And so even if your circumstance hasn't changed with transparency, mine hasn't, I have definitely still felt a difference just in my peace that comes just from being in God's presence and from feeling a closeness to Him and knowing that He's there, He's listening, and He cares.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about dependency throughout this series and how important that is in our walk with Jesus. And I think I've been reminded that when you take that time to take whatever your biggest burden is to Him, often you're reminded when you're praying of how little you actually control and how little power that you have. So it actually drives you to pray about other things, smaller things, even the very smallest of things. All of a sudden I find myself praying over those things as well. And I think some of that has spurred on a lot of gratitude for the Lord of just, He hasn't answered this big request yet. But it's been, like you said, it's been so nice just to be in His presence, to receive His joy, to walk with Him on a daily basis. So I definitely think that's going to be true for a lot of our people as well.
Yeah, and to just be reminded who He is. Because it goes back to, I think it was week 1 when Pastor Bruce was talking, maybe it was week 2, when he preached on just remembering that He's a good dad. And I think when we are asking Him for things in that spirit of dependence, we do come to Him like kids, and it's much easier to remember Him for who He actually is.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so we are here with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank, also with Michelle Myers, who is our discipleship coordinator. And Pastor Bruce, today we've got a little group of questions lined up, questions that people have asked in the past, questions that come up often. So we're going to do a little Ask Pastor Bruce today.
Little FAQs,
FAQ, if you will. Some frequently asked questions. So we're just going to run through these. Would love to hear some of your thoughts on these. If you're cool, if I just go ahead and jump right in. First one being related to our teaching series. So we're in our 21 Days of Prayer series right now. And as we are actually, it's hard to believe, already getting toward the end of that 21 days, how would you encourage people to keep that habit of prayer going beyond the series?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a bunch of little things, so to speak. I think once, somebody said if you do something for 21 days, or actually the negative is what I heard. If you don't do something for 21 days, you break the chain. But I think the positive is hopefully in these 21 days, or what are we like, numbers 16 or 17?
Yeah.
Hopefully there's already become some holy habits, but some little things that definitely keep it fresh. It's always good. I mean, praying the Psalms. We talked about praying Scripture, but if you pray the Psalms, now some of them you probably want to put a filter on only because of the nature of them. But at the same time, praying the Psalms, praying Scripture keeps it fresh. Don't discount, oftentimes, and preacher's the worst, and I'm the worst of oftentimes, discounting the quick prayers. because the Bible does say pray without ceasing, which doesn't mean you're praying 24/7, but it does mean you're almost like continuing an attitude of prayer, almost a conversation, because, it is a relationship with God.
Right.
And so part of that relationship is praying. But on the other hand, those times when it's, you trying to focus on prayer, that is super important to do on a regular basis as well. The ACTS, giving it some structure, just loosely based on the Lord's Prayer, having those, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. Those things have, I remember hearing that back, 30 years ago, and I still roughly kind of use that just to make sure I don't get imbalanced. And usually the imbalance is gimme. Nothing wrong with that, but by the time you get through the other three, you tend to ask differently. So there's just a few of the things. Praying the Word, praying the Psalms in particular, I think of the most. Those are some handles. Obviously, having some accountability. Accountability is sometimes looked at. Encouragement. It's like we're going to start that. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but I just realized that even this morning, and kind of starting in looking at the book of James, and I think it's 15 times in that book, which is filled with exhortation, 15 times the phrase either brothers or brothers and sisters, which is a reminder of me. It is like, listen, this is, again, it's not a solo sport. This is a team sport, and that's the case with holy habits as well, because, discipline's good, but, if you have a brother or sister who is, going to go, how's your quiet time, or what's the Lord showing you, or any of that stuff, it just tends to spur you on, which is the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
So those are a few things.
Yeah, absolutely. Michelle, anything you want to jump in there too?
I think just a reminder that if you are developing a new habit of prayer, habit stacking is really helpful. And so if you already have something that you do with consistency, whether that's as simple as you're brushing your teeth, or you are on your morning commute, or picking up kids from the school, whatever it is, to weave prayer into that routine. I think sometimes when you stack it on top of an established habit already, it can help you develop some consistency.
Well, that's good. Habit stacking.
Yeah.
I did not invent that word.
Did you not?
No.
I have not heard of doom scrolling, but habit stacking is better.
Yeah, that's a new one. That's a new one.
All right.
Very helpful
I'm gonna
nonetheless.
use that one.
No, that's awesome. Thanks so much for jumping in there. Second question here, and this one's kind of a big one, but I think very practical and helpful, is how do I desire God more on a daily basis?
Oh, I would say if you don't, be honest with God about it. It's like like when we do a sermon on like getting your Bible or praying. One of the things I try to include is, listen, God already knows your heart, and if it's dry and dusty and distant, then don't act like it's not. And God runs to the humble. The Bible talks about over and over again, when we humble ourselves, that's when God shows up. So if you already know that's the condition, it's like, I don't want to spend time with God. And especially, 1 or 2 days, everybody gets there at times. But if you stay there, that's when it gets really dangerous.
Right.
And I would say the start of it is to be honest. God, I need you to revive my heart. I need you to give me a hunger. Because once that begins, then it's, even when it comes to like scripture, you'll see a bunch of it. Some of it, David, he goes from, all right, I'm going to do this, to this is my delight. I would rather have this more than it's sweeter than honey. It's more valuable than gold, all those things. But again, I would go back to kind of that original one as well, is there's nothing like the exhortation of brothers or sisters to spur you on. Because, and don't be in despair if you're going through a dry season. It's not that God has changed, but somebody said one time, it's sort of like the tide. It's going to come back in. But you don't judge your walk with God based on your emotions and how you're feeling. So you go back to the gospel, you go back to what Jesus has done for you. You sit in that, and you ask God to revive your heart. But again, there's some things that you don't. We talk about grace a bunch, and we should. We talk about the gospel a bunch. It's interesting. Again, going into James, some of them weren't comfortable with James because it's not in any way the opposite of all the grace talk, which is in the Bible. It's not like, okay, James talks about do stuff and the rest of the Bible talks about grace. Right. I mean, they're molded together because James is talking about a faith that actually works. But the whole idea would be, if I don't feel like it, I can still do it. It's sort of like even when we talk about marriage. It's like, I don't feel like loving my husband. Yeah, well, you do it until you feel like it. You do the right thing and then trust God with the emotions. And emotions aren't bad. They're not to be the Lord. Jesus is to be the Lord.
Yeah.
If emotions are the Lord, that is the cultural That is the cultural God of our times right now. My authentic feelings, my authentic me. Well, Jesus is, it's not about you being the authentic you. It's about denying yourself. It's about following Jesus. It's about those things. So again, I think that's at least an answer. But again, having some brothers and sisters that'll spur you on when you're, it's like it's like a team. Solo sports are super hard because it's just you.
Right.
But you got 10 other guys or 8 other guys or whatever your sport. I don't even know how many they have in soccer. You go play soccer. I don't even know what all sides is in soccer.
I feel like it's 11.
All right, so I don't know. It's like soccer. So, don't even mention pickleball. Pickleball is not a sport. So
it can't be a team
it is
sport.
not. It is not a sport. It is not a sport. So there is no team activity. But hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
Follow that one.
I can't.
Come on now.
I don't think I have anything for that one.
Pickleball shot.
How encouraging is it though when I think about even just little things like when we have our staff meetings and we're sharing how God's moving.
Yes.
To go back to your brothers and sisters' comment, when you're around people who are telling you about what God's doing in their lives or in other people's lives, that drives, it should drive your hunger for God.
That's right.
Especially in a dry season where you're like, man, I want that.
For sure.
I want that.
And also it's not just that, but also when you share. So even if you're sharing what God taught you, like even right now when I'm talking a little bit about with y'all earlier about James, I mean, that's sort of cementing into my life. But then also if you, when you share your faith with somebody, because you become immediately dependent because it tends to be intimidating or you're like, I don't want to be rejected or whatever that is. So there's a bunch of ways, but bottom line is there's what does somebody say? That the Christian sanctification of the Christian life is a lot less linear than it is circular. In other words, we think of the Christian life as linear. It's like, all right, I just stack, I do this and I graduate to this and graduate, but basically it's the same 4 or 5 things over and 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 over again. In a little bit, not deeper way, so to speak, but if the center is the gospel, and then there's like 4 or 5 things around there that are going to be the same they're the same thing that I learned as a brand new believer that I need to practice now. The word, I mean, everybody, the word, prayer, fellowship, evangel. Those are like the same things. So again, you can't, if you take one of those out, you're going to start to limp a little bit, either one. And that's the case for all of us, preachers included.
Yeah. So question related to that, you mentioned some of those fundamentals. Maybe that's not the best word, but some of those basic things that as we follow Jesus. So if for someone who's listening, watching, and they're like, I want to start reading the Bible every day. We've talked a lot about prayer in the last couple weeks, but for people who are like, I want to get into the Word, I want that to become a habit, where do I start? What would you say?
Definitely either Daniel, Ezekiel, or Revelation, for sure.
Yeah, you can do what I'm doing and read Jeremiah, and you're like,
That's right where you start. No, I say a bunch. It's like most of the Bible is 2 + 2 = 4. Most of the Bible, but there's some that's like algebra, and the algebra sections are like those ones I just mentioned. Right. So if I'm new to the Bible, certainly the Gospel of John is a great place to start. Not just because it's one of the 4 Gospels, because of the audience it was written to is a little less culturally distinct than we are now. So there's not as many cultural hurdles to jump. But any of the Gospels are great, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But I would encourage John. From there, I'd probably go to 1 John. And so there's a book I think I mentioned it a few months ago, that if you're brand new to Bible study and you're like, I want to learn 2 things. One, read the Bible versus books about the Bible, generally speaking.
Right.
Yeah.
And then secondly, but there is a book that has the most condensed overarching one. It's that book by Max Anders called 30 Days to Understanding the Bible. It just goes through the way the Bible's set up. A lot of people think you read the Bible like you read a book front to back, and you can do that. That's just not the way it was necessarily designed. I mean, you almost have to think of it like a library. A collection of 66 books within a bigger book. So anyway, but I'd start John or 1 John, but John would be the one I would say.
Yeah, that's great.
To start.
Yeah, I love the analogy you've given about how the Old Testament is like a sonogram, because it's one story, everything points to Jesus, and then when Jesus comes on the scene, it's like the baby is here. And so it's just much easier to see and understand.
For sure.
And so then after you have a clear understanding of that, then you can go back and you can make more sense of the whole story pointing to Jesus.
Because some of the sonograms, it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on there. I mean, month 2, you're like,
what is that?
What is that?
You need someone to interpret it, like the doctor.
Well, and like you do in, parts, Isaiah can be a challenging book. That is definitely, I would definitely start in the New Testament if you're new to Bible study, for what Michelle exactly said. One is much clearer, and the other one has an original meaning to the original hearers, but also it's like casting forward about what Jesus is going to do.
Yeah. So I want to go, speaking of Old Testament, something that just got brought up there. This is one that comes up, from time to time. People, it's like, okay, I'm jumping in, I'm going to start reading, and then you start reading Leviticus, and you're in the laws, and you're like, why don't we follow all these laws? So want to just kind of give some space. For some people, this will be a refresher. For others, the first time hearing this, just the simple, plain question of, hey, why don't we follow all the laws that are in the Old Testament?
Yeah, simple answer would be this, because oftentimes, especially in political season, and you'll hear politicians basically, if they typically it's like, all right, how about Old Testament says, and they grab usually something like don't eat shellfish or fabrics or something like that, and then they'll usually equate it typically to some sexual morality. And they're like, well, if we don't do this one, why should we, let's just either chunk the whole thing out or not. You guys are selective. You Christians, you cherry pick versus, not that Christians can't cherry pick. We can be bad at that. But in this case, the reason we don't follow some of the laws in the Old Testament is simply because Jesus said, he tells us how to interpret the Bible, and he said he fulfills the law. He fulfills the law. He also says, I don't take one jot, one tittle away from it. But he said, I'm the fulfillment of the law.
Yeah.
And so, it's sometimes helpful. You're not going to see this. You might see it in the study Bible, but you're not going to see this in the actual text. But you can tell from the laws, so to speak. The law. When you talk about the law, you're talking about all the commands, not just the 10 Commandments.
Right.
But you're basically, you can divide them up into about 3 different categories, so to speak, and it's always been helpful, for me. And one of them is the civil law, which was given primarily to Israel, because he's trying to set up he's setting up a nation who had been enslaved for 400 years. And it's like, I don't want you, even like eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, that kind of thing. He's like, because before what they would do is somebody would insult you, you'd kill them. And no, you got to have, we got to have something a little more equal here. So civil law, some of them are that. All right, we're not Israel. We're not theocracy. So you kind of can take some of those out. You've got what's called the ceremonial law, and this is typically where a lot of the fabrics and the shellfish and all that stuff get thrown in there. But that's clearly a picture pointing to the holiness of God and then God's deliverer. All right. And then the other one is typically known as the moral law, which it's about God's character. Most of that would be like the 10 Commandments and some other ones. And God does not change, and those are still, and I think they're all the 10 Commandments are repeated in the New Testament except Sabbath?
Okay.
There's one of them that's not repeated. All the rest of them are. I think it's Sabbath. But again, the Sabbath rhythm is still there, and it's not the discount, but the people like, the other ones are not repeated, like the shellfish. That's not in the New Testament. But in a nutshell, if somebody's like, why do we not do them all? Because we're trying to read the Bible like Jesus told us to read the Bible.
Yeah.
And he said he fulfills that, as Michelle said earlier, that Old Testament, a lot of that, where the sonograms, the shadows, the pictures, the drawings, like this is what's happening coming up.
Yeah.
That does come up all the time. And if you want a book to read about that, probably the best book, what would you say, Galatians? Probably. I would say Galatians, that is not super easy to understand in the New Testament because it's dealing with those answers. It's talking about the law. One overarching thing, when you talk about the law in general, and Galatians talks about this, many people talk about it being about a map and a mirror, a map and a mirror, map and a mirror. A map, this is the way life does, flourish. You obey the 10 Commandments, life tends to go better, just by the way God's designed everything to work. But it's also a mirror, and that's where Galatians, I think it's 3, comes in, where it says the law was a tutor, a schoolmaster to point us to Christ.
Right.
Basically, let's say, I'm breaking all these laws.
No way I can keep all
I can't
this.
keep these, so I need somebody to do for me what I can't do for myself, hence the gospel.
Yeah. I think a couple examples that jump to mind. One is Peter in the book of Acts, when God gives him a vision. Now all of a sudden, God's like, hey, all these things, Old Testament laws that you were following when it comes to dietary laws.
Go kill it and eat it.
Yeah.
Great verse.
Great Amen to that, right? And we are the beneficiaries of that. We got bacon because of that.
That's God's blessing.
Yeah. No, but it is helpful to know that there are answers for that, because it does, like you mentioned, it often gets weaponized against people who believe the Bible. So it's helpful to have that as a defense for your faith. A couple of, I guess, more personal questions that I would love to hear your thoughts on. One of the big things we've been talking about with 21 Days of Prayer, a lot of people are praying for prodigals, sons, daughters, who are running from the Lord or whatever the situation may be. So I'd love to ask, for the people who are still praying, they haven't seen an answer to that yet, how do they love their prodigals well while they wait?
Sure. General stuff. I mean, I would say don't give up. Don't give up praying. I would tell them to have a few promises that are in context. Now, you're not going to really find, and don't use Proverbs 22:6 because that's a proverb, not a promise, which we've talked about. I think it's Proverbs 22:6 about train up a child.
Right.
In the way that you should go, and in the end they will not depart from it. That is a principle more than it is a promise.
Right.
I say that there's a bunch of other verses, I think I read a couple of weeks ago, that are very, very good, whether it be Ephesians chapter 1, I'm blanking out on some of them even right now, but some that you can actually apply. Psalm 27, like 15 is also a good one. I would have despaired if I did not believe I'd see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. So, but there's a bunch of ones you can use to help your faith. Because there are going to be times when you're like, I don't see it, I don't believe it. And you're like the dad in, Mark 9, Matthew 17, I do believe, help my unbelief.
Right.
And it's like, I do believe, I really do, but I'm struggling in this one area. And that's, there's no pain like kid pain. So what I would say is, I think your question was, how do you love them? I would keep the relationship alive. If you have nothing in common, because if they're away from the Lord, you're going to have you love the Lord and they don't love the Lord. There's like an awesome gap there.
A rift, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also a gap because, if if your life is centered around the Lord, then that's a lot of your conversation too, a lot of your family discussion.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, how do you not be superficial and just talk about, the weather and the lake and whatever?
Yeah.
And I think that'd be one of the harder ones. But I would say keep the relationship alive, even if it means a text or whatever, depending on their age. Hey, I love you. Praying for you today. Hope you had a great Labor Day weekend. Somebody said, always you want the posture of the prodigal father. Which, if you read Luke 15, he didn't chase after him and he didn't lower his standards, but the picture is when the son took a step home, he was waiting for him and looking for him. Because I think doesn't the text say it's like when he was still a long way off.
He ran down.
Which, the implication, because really the story is really not about the prodigal son. The story in Luke 15 is about the father who doesn't give up.
Right.
Because, look, it's the third of three parables. And the whole thing was about I'm not giving up and celebrating when that comes home. Whether it be, I think it's the sheep and the silver and then the son.
Yeah.
And the son's the longest, the most well-known one. But it's really part 3 of one parable is the prodigal son. But the whole thing about the prodigal son, it's really about the dad. And the dad in the story is God.
Yeah.
And actually, we're the prodigal son. Israel's a prodigal son, probably contextually, we're the prodigal son. But the whole point is what reception will they get? And what you don't want to do is have them, somebody said this one time, don't have them have to walk over all the I told you so's when God jerks the rug out. And that's where, honestly, some of those, the earlier question about praying the Psalms, there's some great prayers in the Psalms for parents of prodigals. Some great ones. Psalm 16, 3, I think it talks about how it says, those that chase after idols, their sorrows will multiply. And so if a prodigal almost by definition is chasing after idols. So there's nothing wrong. It's not unloving for you to pray Psalm 16, whatever that is, verse 3. God, would you show my daughter, my son, the sorrows, the emptiness, the vanity that comes from chasing after these idols that she's chasing after. And so anyway, but how do you love them? You love them. You love them. I think it was Billy Graham. I think he was asked, what would you do? What would you do if one of your children said they were gay? And he said, I think I would love them more. That was a long time ago too. That was 25 years ago. And he had a prodigal, obviously, with Franklin. And then also, if you want some encouragement, I'm trying to remember which book by Jim Cymbala. Maybe it's in Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire, but the story about his prodigal and the whole story about how she came home and the way that he was I mean, it's a remarkable story. I was like, good night. And it's very faith building. I know it's Jim Cimbalo's great guy up in Brooklyn Tab. And I think it's Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire. Does that sound right?
I think so.
Okay.
I think it is.
If not, it's one of them.
Yeah.
Just buy them all. They're all good.
It's interesting. I'm hearing you say in some ways, like, to take the posture that God takes toward us, toward that prodigal, is sort of the underlying idea. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always the goal. I mean, God is like we talked about a couple weeks ago, he is the perfect father in the way he fathers. And so we want to emulate that as best we can. And he is the prodigal father, because that is really the subject matter. I mean, the prodigal son gets all the press, but the story is about God's reception of that. And then even the way he deals with the older brother. I mean, the whole thing is, the emphasis is on the dad and the rebuke that the son gave the dad. Basically, it's like, I wish you were dead. I want the stuff now. I'm going to treat you as dead. And then he didn't lower the standards. He basically left him to, and then, it's a parable, so it has one main point, but the main point would be, the prodigal father is the main point, more than the son.
Yeah, best short story ever told.
Keller's got a good book called Prodigal God? Prodigal God, Prodigal God, which is on Luke 15, but it's a good read.
That's great. That's great. So would love to hear from both of you on this. Advice for moms and dads in particular who are trying to lead their families well, following Jesus together.
Ladies first.
Okay, so on this one, I think so many times when we're in those leadership positions, we want to think about us as leading, but I think we get to remember that we're followers first. And so you take a lot of the pressure and anxiety off of yourself when you remember that you will naturally lead when you are following Jesus as quickly and as closely as you possibly can. And so how you lead your family is going to filter from your personal walk with the Lord. And so before you try to order these steps and there's nothing wrong with praying as a family devotions, any of those things, those are great things, but it will overflow so much more naturally and be part of your family DNA when it comes out of a natural relationship with Christ. And so if you want to lead your family, then be close to Jesus because he's at the front of the line. And so just aim for that. Yeah.
And that's if you're a brand new parent, that's gold, because really everything flows from what Michelle just said. What is it? Above all else, guard your heart. We could say walk. Right. Your walk with the Lord. Above all else, guard your heart, for from it flows the well springs of life, including parenting. So if you are being parented well, which means you're walking with the Lord, then you are going, because there's you could do 20 tips and tricks for parenting, and those are useful in and of themselves. Right. But an example would be, if you're walking with the Lord, then you're continually getting humbled and those kind of things. And so, for example, probably one of the things I would definitely do over when the kids were smaller, I thought it was weakness to apologize if I overreacted or whatever, especially when you're a preacher and you're thinking you're supposed to be perfect and all that stuff. But in reality, you know what? There are times you're going to make mistakes as a parent. They know you made a mistake. You know you made a mistake. Instead of just ignoring it, it can be because they don't need a perfect dad or a perfect mom. They need a mom or dad that walk with Jesus, and then they need a picture of Jesus. And part of that is you know what? I'm sorry. I blew it. I blew my top driving to Destin.
Hypothetically
speaking, I've used that story.
I don't know if I know that story.
One story, real quick, parent failure. I think the boys are maybe 8 and 10. My mom be off. Tyler can probably do it. So we're driving. We're living in Houston at the time. We're driving to Destin, which is a long drive. And so we're that was back in the time where you trade you didn't have the headphones and all that stuff. So you're like, whose music you going to listen to and all that kind of stuff. I was like, all right, we're going to listen to X. We'll listen to yours. We're going to have a quiz first because, of course, you preacher kids, you got to make sure they're knowing the Bible. So I was like, I'll start off easy. And I gave them a couple of them, and I was like, well, here's a super easy one. Who did Jesus raise from the dead in John chapter 11? And I thought this was like cake. Yeah. And they're like, silence. And I was starting to get irritated. I was like, you guys are leaders. And it's like, who did Jesus raise from the dead in John chapter 11? Peter. Peter. It's like, no, not Peter. What are you talking about, Peter? No, Peter didn't get raised, for instance, and John. No. So I was like, no, you're not listening to him. I was like, turn the radio off for 30 minutes. I was getting text until you figure out who did it, and then we'll listen to the song. I was like, that's such a fail. Because I was like, okay, it's for those listening, it's Lazarus. So example would be what I should have done. I don't think I ever did, was to go back and go, man, that was a fail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Should live and learn.
Yeah. Man, that's great feedback. Thank you. All those questions, very, very helpful. Pastor, as we wrap up, we are heading into Sunday, and we are kicking off a new teaching series. So I would love to just give you a minute to share maybe whatever preview you want to give of our teaching series starting Sunday.
All right, this Sunday we are going to be starting in the book of James, half-brother of Jesus. And when you walk in, whatever campus you're going to, you'll get a journal. Our guys, including Mr. Christian Cooper over here, done a great job of putting a scripture journal together that has a place to take notes, all sorts of resources and all that in there. If you've never done it, James is not a long book, but it is packed with stuff that we deal with, like trials, temptations, comparison, anger, all that kind of stuff. So not at all hard to follow, but we'll start this week. You're like, what do y'all calling the series? So we're calling it the book of James. All right, so it's the book of James. We're going to kick it off this time in all services, so can't wait.
It's going to be a great Sunday.
Yeah, first Bible book I ever studied as a Christian.
Man, coming back around.
Back around.
That's awesome.
Vintage.
As we go through this 21 days of prayer, a journey as a church, we've been talking about this the last 2 weeks, but we want to give you some practical action steps you can take to build a life of prayer in your own life on a daily basis. So, Michelle, today we're going to be talking about prayer walking, which is, I know, a big thing in your life.
Yep.
So let me just kick it to you to start out with. What do we even mean by that, and why should people be thinking about it?
Okay, so I am a kinesthetic learner, and so for me, movement somehow, it makes my brain focus better.
Right.
And so I actually started in prayer by prayer walking, and I think it happened by accident, honestly. I don't think that it was intentional. It was just a moment when I was walking and I didn't have any technology with me and I got quiet. And so I think actually before I prayer walk, I think I prayer listen. I just listen and ask the Lord to prompt my heart about things. But there's something about being in creation, especially where we live. You know, you see the mountains and I don't look at the mountains and think about how big I am. I usually am reminded of God, how big He is. And there's something about the movement pattern that even just gets me in the habit of talking to the Lord. And so if you've never done this before, then I would recommend actually getting a couple of we're going to habit stack a little bit here.
Yeah.
Because your prayer cards, bringing those with you on a walk, whether that is having a couple of scriptures that you want to pray over, a couple of things that you've done, but sometimes having that as a visual reminder, because I think our phones can be a distraction.
Right, yeah.
Even if you...
Can they really?
Yeah, just a little.
Just kidding.
Just a little. But even if you make the efforts to turn off all the things, they're still there and you can still turn them off and re-engage turn them back on. So I recommend technology free if you're going to do a prayer walk. Have those cards with you to prompt, but taking the time to listen in between.
Yeah.
And so I know for me sometimes I have a familiar beaten path in my neighborhood that I go on that I actually think that I might be able to do blindfolded at this point. But there's also sometimes when my kids are at new schools this year. And so I went and just prayer walked around the schools and it was just visually, I would see things. I would see a car drive in. It would remind me to pray for the teachers and the administration and then the friends that my kids would have and their opportunity for them to have gospel conversations.
Yeah.
There's just something about having those visual reminders, if you're a visual person, that can be helpful as you pray. And so there's no wrong way to do it, though.
Yeah. I love the way you said that. There really is no wrong way to do it. For me, I have an extended time in the morning where I'm reading and praying, and I'm doing that in a room. I'm not moving around.
Right.
But oftentimes, how often do you read the Bible and then an hour later you feel wait, what did I read? What did God teach me?
Yes.
What was He trying to tell me? And so often after lunch sometimes, or maybe even during a lunch break, I'll just take a quick lap around the building, and it's that same thing, that prayer walking time of just let me try to come back to some of the things I know God's been trying to teach me, but also like new things have happened since then. And how do I pray through my day and ask him for guidance and wisdom? And like you said, all of a sudden when you get moving, like there's real science to that.
Yes.
With your brain and just your blood flow. And all of a sudden it's like you're in the sweet spot of prayer when you're doing some prayer walking. So just one more time, let's say somebody's listening and they're like, I want to do this tomorrow. Just first steps. I know you mentioned a couple, but anything else practically you would recommend?
I would say have an idea of things that you would like to talk about and just say, I want to bring these things before the Lord. And so whatever that means for you, if you can remember them or if you want to have something written down, but then just to remembering that it is a dialogue and leave that space for listening. Ask the Lord to prompt your heart to pray for things, maybe even that you don't know. Because I find that a lot of times I begin praying with the things that I want to talk about, but then as I get into that conversation with the Lord, he reminds me. And I find myself praying for things I wasn't planning on. And so I take a few minutes even when I get back after my prayer walk because I want to remember some of the things that I felt God stir in my heart.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, thank you to everybody for listening today, for watching today. We do this hopefully as an encouragement for you in your walk with Jesus. So I want to encourage you, put some of these things into practice in your own life and just watch how God is faithful throughout that journey. Next week, really this week, today's Wednesday when this comes out. So Sunday, we're kicking off our brand new James teaching series. We've got scripture journals for you at every single campus. We cannot wait to start this new series with you. So if you're listening, you're watching, join us on Sunday. What a special day to gather with everybody, to worship the Lord together, to learn together, to jump into James together. And then we'll be back next Wednesday for another podcast episode. As always, you're loved and sent.